Sometimes when I'm evaluating prospects, I take a look at a guy and I sit there and I say, why isn't this guy getting more attention? And there's other guys I sit there and I watch and I'm like, I don't see why they're getting this much attention. But that's the nature of the beast. So often it is a matter of perspective, and let's face it, it really is an inexact science, especially for us amateur ham and eggers, that the pro wannabes that would love nothing more than to do this for a career, but probably aren't good enough to do it for a career. But I digress. Anyways, one thing that stands out as you evaluate this 2017 NFL draft class is the tight end class is very good. It is really, really good. And in particular, I thought the tight end class, along with the defensive backs, really, really shined big time at the combine. I mean, you saw tight ends putting up monster numbers in the 40, monster numbers in the vertical, monster numbers in the broad jump. And while just because a guy is a great athlete, it doesn't mean he's a great football player. When you look at the natural evolution of the NFL and you see how important the tight end position has become, it had to wet the whistles of a lot of NFL scouts and front office executives to see just how athletic this tight end class is. And one of the best athletes in this year's tight end class is Evan Engram from Ole Miss. 6'3", 235-pound senior from Ole Miss, who frankly probably did himself quite a bit of good by going back to school for 2016. Even though Ole Miss didn't have the greatest season, maybe disappointed just a little bit, the fact of the matter is Evan Engram was probably going to be a third to fourth round pick if he had declared for the 2016 draft, even in a much weaker tight end class. But he went back, improved upon some things, and has put himself in a position where he could be in the conversation, the consideration to be taken at the tail end portion of round number one in a much stronger draft this year than what was last year, and in particular, a much stronger tight end class. And what's crazy about an Evan Engram is he could go in the first round and still be only the third tight end taken. Now, as I evaluate Evan Engram, I see some of what people are excited about. You look at his quickness and his speed, especially his speed. When you see a tight end run in the low 4.4s like that, that was near historic performance at the combine for what Evan Engram did. I mean, that was a monster number that he put up in the 40. I will say sometimes I don't know if that speed always shows up on film as much as it should. Now, granted, once he ran that low 4.4, I had to factor that in at least somewhat into the grade because there are times where that big time speed does show up on film for Evan Engram. I just wish it would show up a little bit more. But he does have the pure raw speed to be a matchup nightmare for linebackers and safeties at the next level. I also think he's pretty good at getting separation. He uses his body well. His quickness, and in particular his speed, allows him to get space relatively consistently. Even though he's not the greatest route runner, he's improved, but he's still got some work to do there. Sometimes he does struggle against physical press type of coverage, especially against linebackers. And maybe it would be nice to see him be able to add some spice to his route running that would allow him to get even more separation. But again, when you're talking about a guy like this and his quicks and in particular his speed, just that alone allows him to create a lot of natural separation over the middle of the field. He's got a pretty good catch radius. He doesn't have an elite catch radius, especially compared to some of the other monster tight ends in this class, like the O.J. Howards, the David Njokus, the Adam Shaheens of the world, the Bucky Hodges as well. But Engram has a pretty nice catch radius, the type of guy that you can throw the ball high to and let him go get it at his highest point. He's got some ability to adjust to the ball. He can work back to get the stop fades. So he's a pretty reliable target in that sense. In terms of intangibles, I like the fact that this kid went back to school in 2016, especially being an undersized tight end. And even now, at 235 pounds, 6'3", he is still a bit undersized. I think he's big enough, similar to like a Jordan Reed. He'll be big enough. He will never be the biggest, obviously, but I felt like I saw some real improvement and growth in his game in 2016. He came back to school and, in my opinion, made the most of it. He became more of a locker room leader, team leader. You look at those type of guys, and you like to see those guys that made that decision to go back to school, be rewarded for it. And I'm glad to say that he's going to be rewarded for it. So when you watch him, you see the 40 numbers and you see some of the other athletic numbers, and you see some of the plays that he made on film. And in particular, he made some big plays in some big time games and against some big time opponents in 2016. Florida State, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas. He had some pretty good games against high level competition. So that suggests to you that he didn't just beat up on the ham and eggers and jabronis in college football. You talk about a guy that played in the SEC, so he played against some top flight teams, some top flight defenses, and he performed very, very well in some of those big games. That is very appealing. So you look at it and you say a tight end that runs with that type of speed, he's got to be a first round talent. Now, look, I think there's a very good chance he ends up going in the tail end portion of round number one, at the very worst, the beginning of round number two. And frankly, if a team like my Chicago Bears drafted him, I'd be very, very pleased with it, because even if he wouldn't be the best player on my board at that point in time, I could understand it, I could get it, and I can see the upside there. But when I look at an Evan Engram and I look at guys like OJ Howard and Njoku, I do see a clear gap from those two guys to Engram. I just really do. I know some people are going to buy into the narrative that because he ends up probably going the tail end of round one, beginning of round two, he's the third best tight end in this class, and I just don't see it that way. And he's got a number of concerns for me that really stand out on film. He's not the biggest guy, and that lack of size really comes into play in terms of his blocking. He's not much of a blocker whatsoever. Now, granted, again, that's not the biggest deal in the world to me, because he's a 235-pound tight end. If you're trying to use him a lot as an inline blocker, you should have your head examined anyways. But with that said, there are times where you want to be able to keep that tight end on the field to where you're not automatically telegraphing the majority of the plays that they're going to be pass plays whenever this guy is on the field. And for me, with Evan Engram, you're not really utilizing him much as a blocker, especially on the line. It can really lead to some predictability in terms of what you do offensively. I think his hands are just okay. I think he could get better, and quite a bit better actually. He can make some spectacular catches. There's no question about it. But I think in general his hand usage could get better. He has a tendency to let the ball get into his body too often, and he'll have some drops on those balls that he catches away from his body. Um, I like to have guys that are sure-handed, and Evan Engram to me is definitely not sure-handed. While his speed and his athleticism overall allows him to create some separation, I think he could definitely be more polished as a route runner. He could do a better job of not rounding off his routes as much as he does at times. Another thing he could do better, and this comes sometimes with a feel and an instinct for the game, is working back to the ball and being able to adjust your route after the initial play has kind of wrapped up, the initial play has been extended. I don't see a natural feel to be able to work back to the quarterback, work himself open once the play is kind of broken down. That's a bit of a concern. Another major concern for me with him has to be his run after the catch. For a guy that is this athletic, he can get some yards after the catch on the move, but I don't think his lateral agility is outstanding. He's not going to make a lot of guys miss. He's not going to run through a lot of tackles. In general, he just wasn't a great ball carrier once he caught the ball. He was average at very, very best. That's probably being a bit generous. And for a guy like Evan Engram, with that lack of size at his position, this is a guy that's battled a myriad of injuries throughout his 4 years at Ole Miss. He never played in every single game in any of his 4 seasons there. And I'm sorry, when you have a guy with average hands who has significant questions about being able to stay healthy, who's not going to be much of an asset for you as a blocker, personally, I would not take the guy in round number one. I would start gambling maybe in round number two, but for me, he's a mid-third round talent. He's not a top three or top four, or frankly, probably even top five tight end in this draft class. I know that's probably going to be a minority opinion, but that's okay. I'm used to it. But my NFL comparison for him is Jordan Reed, another guy that was a mid-round pick coming out of Florida, who's had a nice career for himself. Again, I don't want to sit there and make this seem like that I'm largely down on Evan Engram. I see upside there, and I definitely see potential. And there's a very good chance that he gets into the NFL and a team figures out how to utilize him, similar to what Washington did with Jordan Reed. And this guy could end up with some 1,000-yard seasons. He could end up going to the Pro Bowl. He could be a very, very good player and vastly outplay his draft position. And if this draft class in general was weaker, and specifically the tight end class was weaker, there's a lot of years where Evan Engram would be the number one tight end in the draft. And at that point in time, I probably have a different consideration about taking him around number one. But to me, there are other guys who provide more athletic and overall physical and positional upside than Evan Engram does. I think he's a good player. I think he's a starter. And I think he's going to be a guy that contributes and contributes nicely. But for me, I have him graded again as a third round pick. I will not knock a team for taking him at the tail end of round one or the beginning of round two because I understand and I get it. I just probably wouldn't make that decision.